Let's go. So welcome to the polystyrene pollution in the Yarra River Phase 2 webinar. This comes as, well, I've been wanting to do this webinar for a while. However, I did think it would be best to wait until, the final few weeks of the project. That way I have some new content for you and some interesting content for you. So yeah, it's been a very interesting 2 years. There's been a lot of things happen, as everyone's well aware. So yeah, there's going to be really interesting stuff. Let's get into it. So the Yarra River Keepers Association acknowledges that the lands and waterways of the Yarra catchment and beyond are the unceded territories of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. We pay our respects to their ancestors who have cared for country since time began, to all Wurundjeri Woiwurrung community, to all the Kulin Nation, to all the traditional owners who continue to speak and care for their country. We acknowledge that the river, now called the Yarra, has always been known as the Birrarung by its custodians. So I thought it would be best to start this with a recap of what Phase 1 was. Now, this is the project that was done before mine. This was done by Nicole Kowalczyk, the previous litter officer. And the three main outcomes of that project was an initial investigation into the possible sources of polystyrene pollution in Melbourne or of the Yarra catchment. That was the core of the project. Nicole also did an initial audit, a visual audit of the Bandalong litter traps, which are the floating litter traps on the Yarra River that collect litter. And that project really laid the groundwork for this further investigation. We needed a bit of evidence to start with to say, well, why do we need to have a serious investigation into this material and the pollution of it? And so that's what the first phase did. But obviously there were limitations to the scope. And we always knew that we were going to have a progression of that. So that is what this project was born after. And I hope to show you that we have indeed furthered our investigation of polystyrene pollution. So the overview of this phase, the two main tasks were to look at the sources. So you can see there in the green, to look at the sources of polystyrene pollution. And then in blue, the other half was to look at the amount of polystyrene pollution that is in the river and attempt to quantify the number of polystyrene pieces in the river. And so from a broad perspective, Clean Water Group, who was our partner again for this project, they did 150 site audits, and that's over 25 different sites, so returning every month. So we've gone to the source to quantify or look over time, how much pollution are these industries accountable for? And then at the other end, in the river, in the water, we're looking at how much polystyrene are we finding in these litter traps to get an idea of how much polystyrene is in the traps every year. As well as that, we also looked at integrating the data from Phase 1 with the Yarra Catchment Atlas, which I'll be talking about later on. We created a polystyrene observation tool for citizen science, and we also redesigned our hotspot rating tool, which I'll show you later. We also looked at understanding the feasibility of analysing polystyrene in a lab to trace it back to its source. And drafted a plan for that study. So I'll talk about that later as well. So let's kick off. Oh, sorry. So still to go in the project before we finish up is the data analysis. So I'm going to show you tonight everything I can, but there is still a bit of analysis I can't do until the final audits have come in. So I'll show you what I can tonight. So source monitoring. Going to the source to find out or quantify polystyrene pollution. So our aims were to identify the biggest contributor over time, to gather evidence, both visually, but also over time, because that was something that was lacking in the first project, the extent of over time. to seek opportunities for improvement, and to understand relative contribution from the different industries. So before I go into the data, what I want to show you is what I've seen over the last 2 years. So I've done many visits to construction sites in order to select sites to monitor. And I'll just show you some of the photos that I've taken when visiting these sites. Now, not every site had pollution, but as you'll see, the vast majority did. And so, yeah, let's have a look at what I've seen. So here we've got construction polystyrene, waffle pods, just flakes of polystyrene coming off. In the middle, we've got an example of some good practice where the polystyrene has been bagged and will be taken back for collection and hopefully recycled. However, I really didn't see much of this. There was some, but I cannot say that the majority of the sites that I saw who were in this phase, putting it into the concrete, had their polystyrene bagged up. And there are a number of reasons for that, which are kind of outside of the scope of this for now. So here's some more photos. This one was particularly bad, this construction site here. This is in the eastern suburbs, southeastern suburbs, and this was a complex of about 12 apartment / townhouses that were being built. And I was standing there watching one of the workers cut the polystyrene up, and I had the polystyrene flying on the wind away from the building. And you can see there where I've circled the orange. If you have a look in the on the nature strip there, it's very clear there's there's going to be hundreds of polystyrene beads there. So that'll be something I'll be touching on later in my recommendations. Yeah, it's like there's no care, there's no common, maybe there's common sense, but then it's ignored. I'm not sure. This was near where I live, and I spotted this on the way past, and I just had to stop and it was a classic example of what goes on if you leave polystyrene outside. I mean, it breaks up into tiny pieces. This is everywhere. This is the story in 2 photos. You leave it outside, it breaks up, tiny pieces, it flies away. That's as quick storytelling as I can show you. So that's some of the things that I've seen in relation to construction. So we did, I did a strong. Well, I visited 80 construction sites. You can see on this map here. Of the sites that I visited, 71% had some form of pollution. And of those, 98% had polystyrene pollution. So we can see that polystyrene makes up a large chunk of construction pollution. You can see there the rankings of those. So I will show you the hotspot rating tool for those who haven't seen it later on. But as you can imagine, as the ranks go up, they get larger amounts of pollution. So not all of them were, really high, but seeing 11 at rating 4 is not very promising. So, and you can see in that, the photo on the left there, there's just somewhat little care given. So some of the issues for construction, waffle pods, which we are aware of. Waffle pods were highlighted in the first project by Nicole. So, putting them in the concrete, as they get cut up, they break apart and then they leak. We also know, or one of the things that I've, in my travels, have seen time and time again is polystyrene cladding, which I believe makes up the majority of polystyrene pollution from construction sites, having seen what I've seen. Modern construction for homes these days, when they're built by cheaper builders, they use polystyrene on the outside and then they render on top. And it's a combination that is becoming more prevalent these days. However, there is no collection that I've seen or that I'm aware of for cladding foam. And so a lot of it gets left in front of the gate in bins with no lids, just left on the street, apparently. So this is a major source for construction of polystyrene pollution. And lastly, dumping. What I will say about dumping is there was one, when I stopped at one construction site, I did have a chat with one of the guys there, and I believe there was some polystyrene on his site, and I spoke to him about it, and he goes, look, to be honest with you, this isn't mine. The house that we just built, we didn't use polystyrene, and he was correct. I could see that they had used bricks. And he said someone had dumped it there. And it's like, and I said to him, you know, is this a common occurrence? Yeah, of course it is. Like, it's happening all the time. If you've got an empty block, someone's going to get dumped on it. And so this is definitely an issue that will need to be tackled. I know that there are people doing work on it. But, you know, for me to see this kind of stuff, it means that things are slipping through the cracks. And so we need to pay more attention to this. So another issue with construction is the speed of construction. This is obviously the same house, photo taken 2 weeks apart. You can see there was no polystyrene on the site in the first one, and only 2 weeks later, it's been used, rendered, and you know the use of it is complete, and now it's sitting there. So when you try to document this, it's really difficult because, you know, how do you keep up with the speed of construction? Like, they're not just going to wait around for us to get ready and put our monitoring devices in place. So that was something that we really had to think about when we were trying to put a number to the polystyrene pollution coming from construction sites. So yeah, so construction's been a big part. It's not the only source, as you'll see shortly. So I just wanted to show everyone give some of the context behind construction and why it's caught our attention. Lockdown hit, as you're all aware, 3 times during this project, or 4 times, which really was a struggle for us to get on the ground and do the work we needed to do. What ended up happening was we originally wanted to put these drain traps outside of the sites to monitor them, and these would have been managed by Clean Water Group. However, we didn't have such a great response from councils. Everyone was struggling, you know, during the first large lockdown, and still recovering from it now. And so that wasn't quite an option for us. So it was like, well, we wanted qualitative evidence over time. How do we get that? Well, let's just go to the sites, let's audit them, fill out a survey form and clean them before we leave. So we know that next time we come, the site's been cleaned. So any polystyrene there is fresh in that month. So it still achieved our aims. And in the end, it actually worked out to be a better method than installing the drain traps, because we're able to cover a wider area and not have more variables to intercept the data, like wind or rain. So it worked out, but we did have that little hiccup early on. So some of the photos, this doesn't contain, so we did 6 cycles. We went 6 months in a row, or Clean Water Group went 6 months in a row to audit these sites. They went at night to avoid being seen and tip off that we were auditing them. I've only got up to cycle 3 here because it's quite repetitive in that sense. So you can see an example of what's going on. So, you know, cycle 1, we found this much, clean it. Cycle 2, we come back, okay, we found this, and on and so on. And then up in the top half, I've got roughly geographically where these sites are. And these will all be presented in the report that gets done. But yeah, so construction again, up past Wallet. It was quite difficult, as you can imagine, you know, picking individual sites all throughout Melbourne. We ended up choosing, or trying to choose, locations with large amounts of construction going on, new development areas where we could be sure to capture at least one site that was going through the phase of polystyrene, because for construction, polystyrene really occurs at three stages. There's putting it in the concrete slab, then they'll build the house and then use it on the outside, like I showed you with the cladding. And so there's a gap in between that. So with construction, it's very much nothing, a lot of use, nothing, a lot of use, nothing, and then a lot of use when they do fit outs and things. So Yeah, we chose certain locations based on, trying to create some certainty that we would get data. White goods, retail, big problem. This was highlighted very clearly in the data. Loading docks, shopping centres, just a real hive for polystyrene pollution, especially the amount of drainage in urban areas. So, it'd be interesting to know the distances for, most retail or shopping centres in Melbourne from, sources to drains. I imagine, you might be able to go no more than, 10, maybe it's 10, 20 meters, I'm not sure, before you hit a drain. So it really doesn't have to travel that far. Again, white goods, here we go, some names, Kmart, Aldi, no surprises, I imagine. Really large chunks just left there. There's a bin in that third photo. Could it end up in the bin? Of course it could, so we'll talk about this later on again. Manufacturers as well. I don't have too many photos, but I don't know if you can see, but in amongst this crushed rock here, there's likely thousands of polystyrene beads in amongst that crushed rock. It's very difficult to see, but yeah, manufacturers again scoring highly. So I thought it was important, one for me, but also to help everyone understand the data and what's going on. I've visualized the project with lockdowns and rain events because I believe that there might be some overlap. So you can see for the source audits when it lined up with a heavy or moderate rain, and also the periods of when we're in lockdown to see if there's any effect on the data. So I'll bring this back up in a few slides. So forgive me for the copy straight out of Excel, but I promise you there's some easier to read graphs coming up. This is what we got for the source audits from cycle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is their hotspot ratings, which I'll show you that here. So that's our hotspot rating tool. We've got category 1 to 5, and each of the categories are essentially a volume capacity until you're into the next category. So when we look at this, we're looking at amounts. I'll show you the volumes shortly. But what I'd like to point, there's a few things that is quite interesting about this. The first one is that we've got here at one site, we've got a 4, 4, and a 4, which is quite interesting when you remember that the sites are cleaned every time. And so you can't take that any other way other to mean that that's a consistently large amount of pollution. If it's a one-off event like the 5 here, you could say, okay, well, there must have been something really large going on there, but to consistently have a 4 is quite high. And also down the bottom here, we can see that the average of the cycles actually went down. Now, you might say, well, that's logical because you're cleaning it and then, it had obviously built up over time and now you came in and started cleaning it. It's like, well, yeah, possibly. But there might be other reasons as well. So, and obviously I've got them there ranked out by industry type. And you can see a general kind of average rating there for them over the 6 cycles. So the distribution, this is over all sites and all cycles. We can see that category 2 and 3 were very clearly the most present. And to tell you what that means, well, category 2 is up to 18 litres of polystyrene pollution in volume. So it's very widespread in the sense that, well, I'll talk about what we can see, but very clearly it's telling us that it's lots of places with small to medium amounts of pollution that's creating an issue. So this is in volume, in litres. So again, we can see the same trend that the amounts are going down over time, with each cycle. It's pretty clear to see that. So what's interesting now is why. So coming back to the project kind of dates overview, I found it very interesting that cycle 5 and 6 coincided both in lockdown, both with rain events before the audit date. So it is possible that and with those rains, we're talking, I believe they were more than 20 millimeters of rain delivered within a day or two. And you know, that could be enough to kind of clean a site up if there is a lot of pollution. And also, particularly cycle 6 is interesting because it came right off the back of a 2-week construction lockdown. So, you know, if you're looking at a construction lockdown for 2 weeks before an audit, well, it seems, you know, somewhat interesting that, or lockdown in general, and then the rain, well, maybe that might explain why cycle 5 and 6 may have lower. And again, it's not conclusive. I can't definitively say that, but it does need to be taken into account. But yeah, there is a general downtrend over time, which is interesting. So averages of volume by industry type. We have construction with the highest amounts of polystyrene pollution, followed by shopping with white goods, markets, manufacturers, and recyclers. And for myself, I would really be interested, even though it was very difficult to be able to, yeah, I'm not actually sure how you would, but to kind of check out the general public and see the relative contribution from them would be interesting as well, because on my travels, I saw many residential homes with polystyrene just left out on the nature strip in large chunks. I've seen bean bags left out on the nature strip next to a drain, things where, you know, it starts to make you wonder, you know, I assume the general public would have a large representation of polystyrene pollution, you know, with single-use items, but also packaging. Just, you know, you buy a new appliance and you've got polystyrene in your house now, so what are you going to do about it? So yeah, that's also another interesting one to note, but definitely construction sites and shopping, taking out the highest volumes there. Here we've got the volumes, but kind of just differently displayed. The bars of the graph are built up with all of the cycles. So we can see, you know, for each site, I haven't put the names there, but for each site, we can see their total contribution ranked up next to each other in terms of volume. So yeah, it's interesting to look at. So what does the data show? Well, polystyrene has a constant leakage risk with use. This is as clear as it can be. If you're going to leave polystyrene outside, it's going to break down. It just will. And that polystyrene that's broken is going to travel. There is no one industry responsible, fully responsible for polystyrene pollution. You know, you can see very clearly, okay, recyclers are the lowest, but, you know, shopping centres, well, how many shops are there in Melbourne? You know, how many construction sites are there in Melbourne? How many markets? It's just distributed across all the industries. But we can see that there are some industries that have higher amounts, being construction sites and white goods, and that provides a good evidence base to now target our next steps and try and reduce the polystyrene coming from them. The amount of polystyrene pollution fluctuates, especially for construction. I spoke about this before, where you've got heavy use, no use, then heavy use again, potentially. And all homes are different. Not all homes are using polystyrene. You know, there are some houses that have been rendered don't have polystyrene underneath. They have aerated concrete. So, you know, it's not all doom and gloom, but there are a large percentage that do. Pollution ranges from individual beads to large chunks. That surprises no one, I assume. Rain and lockdown may have affected the data. So obviously I'll go into further detail in the report that gets written up, but these are the really easy takeaways that are quite obvious, but supported. So with that, the second half of this project looked at polystyrene on the river. And the aims of this was to quantify how much polystyrene is caught in the litter traps per year, how much polystyrene, or estimate how much polystyrene flows down the Yarra every year, educate about the amount of polystyrene pollution in the river, and engage citizen scientists to help audit the samples. You can see here on the right in this photo, we've got a photo of some of the litter in the Bandalong litter traps, which is what we audited. It's just a soup of polystyrene. And you know, this has come from all over Melbourne, broken up into tiny pieces. So what did we do? Well, I visited the Bandalong litter traps every 6 weeks, and we took 2 samples from each trap each time. And these were randomly generated quadrants of the trap, so that we could then extrapolate our data up and arrive at a figure for what is in that. I mean, you look at, you look in the contents and you wouldn't even know where to start putting a number on it. So we did it methodically. We took our time. We definitely took our time. I'll show you that later. So we met up with volunteers. I know there's 1 or 2 volunteers in the audience that might see photos of themselves tonight. Thank you. But yeah, it's kind of ridiculous that it's got to this. You know, like looking at the bottle, in order to prove that it's a problem, we're having to go through and pick each of these individual beads off and count them. It's like, you know, I understand it. You know, you really have to come to this. But anyway, nonetheless, we did it. And the volunteers were a massive help. I wouldn't have been able to do it without them. Absolute legends. So a big thank you to all the volunteers who were involved. You will know as well as I how tedious, sometimes stinky, and just, yeah, ridiculous it was to go through all those pieces. We had COVID hit us again when we were meeting up in person, and in response to that, we started this possible crowdfunding campaign to, to begin the Great EPS audit race. The time was on to finish the project. The amount of samples were piling up because they were still collecting more, but they weren't getting audited. And so we had no choice but to move into the home and send the samples out and yeah, get help. And so the samples were sent out to a wide range of volunteers who spent their time helping this cause and helping this project to put a number on the amount of polystyrene pieces. So I'd also like to thank everyone who supported that campaign. You know, I mean, if I had to put words to it, just a massive amount of gratitude for your support. You know, it was stressful at times, so it was good to know that we had the community support for this. So we thank you very much. So the home sorting, some quick stats, some lovely photos from the volunteers. We had 50 volunteers thereabouts, audit samples overall, which is great, an astounding number. 142 samples have been sorted as of today, and we are waiting on 10 more. And over 300 hours, volunteer hours, have been put into picking little pieces of polystyrene from soil and putting them into bags. But I assure you it's been worth it. And yeah, let's get into the stats. So what did we find in the samples? Well, the smallest one was 30 pieces, and the largest one, which was an anomaly, but nonetheless true, over 3,000 pieces in that scoop that I took. That volunteer, I've already thanked him and sent in my admiration because I've done a 2,000 piece sample and I was just praying for it to stop. So I can imagine what that might have been like. And then on the right, we separated them into microplastics and macroplastics. Yeah, so obviously macroplastics larger than 5 millimeters were a lot smaller in number, in representation, very clearly due to the nature of polystyrene in that it's a piece made up of very small pieces. So it's natural that it will break up. Total pieces counted so far, this number is actually higher than that. It's slightly outdated, but let's just say over 80,000 pieces of polystyrene have been picked out and counted. And the vast majority of those are microplastics. The sample ranges, so we can see of the samples, kind of what was the average kind of looking at, very clearly up to 900 pieces. So up to 900 pieces was mostly represented in the samples, which is possibly a good result. It could have been a lot worse than that. And it's good to have some consistency there for when we extrapolate up. If we were getting numbers all over the place, you know, it might have been a bit harder to extrapolate. And also it kind of shows you that the influx of polystyrene could be somewhat consistent because these are taken, you know, over quite a while, looking back at the dates chart that I made. So some interesting numbers there. And this is kind of what we're, well, I guess what we're here for. So these are not yet confirmed. We're still working on the numbers, waiting for samples to come back before we can calculate them. But these numbers represent the average number of pieces estimated over the cycle. So for trap number 1, Vanderlong litter trap number 1, we've got all 5 cycles represented. So we've got 5 dots there, which indicates that the average number has been taken from over 5 different cycles. And number 7, it's only got 1 dot because that trap was actually removed after the first time I sampled it by Parks Victoria because it needed repairs, and it wasn't put back at all during the rest of the study. So we only have 1 data point for it, which is why I highlight that with a orangey dot. So it's going to be interesting to see once the rest of the data comes in to see the numbers, but the maths indicates these are the amounts of polystyrene in each trap in 1 year, very clearly in 1 year. Now, what I'm going to, I mean, the numbers kind of speak for themselves, I guess. What I would like to talk about is why are these numbers an underestimate? Because they are an underestimate. And it's because not all polystyrene ends up in these traps. Polystyrene, there's many, many thousands of pieces sitting in the reed beds along the Yarra. There's polystyrene that has evaded the traps, and I'll talk about that in a moment, referencing some data from the lovely work that the Port Phillip Eco Centre did. And polystyrene that was missed in the audit. So we did what we could. There are many, many small pieces of polystyrene. The volunteers will be able to tell you that, you know, you think you're done and you move it around and you find another 20 pieces or 100 pieces. So it is very difficult to collect every piece, and that does have an impact on the extrapolation when we pull it out. So it is an underestimate for these 3 reasons, and that's important to remember, though, you know, these numbers should be concerning. They should be concerning. So what is the data showing? Well, it shows a range from 3 million to 20 million pieces per trap per year. And this range isn't finished yet. We haven't got, as I said, we haven't got the data from some of the other traps. It's an underestimate as well. The distribution of that is 9% macroplastics and 91% microplastics, which is a concerning figure because we know microplastics are more likely to be ingested by aquatic wildlife, and those microplastics will continue to break down, track chemicals to their surfaces. There's many problems with that. So the Port Phillip Eco Centre's latest report estimated that 15, I believe it was 15% of the litter items in the Yarra were polystyrene. If you calculate those numbers, they estimate that 290 million pieces are going down the Yarra into the bay every year. So their study was conducted downstream of the most downstream trap, which means these amount of pieces are getting past the litter traps. And so that must mean that, well, okay, we need to look at how many pieces are getting past, how many pieces are getting caught, and that will give us a somewhat fair indication of how many pieces are getting into the Yarra every year. And that's excluding the pieces still stuck in the reed beds, pieces cleaned up by drain traps, pieces cleaned up by, or pieces missed in sampling. And so, as you can see very clearly, at an average of 8 million pieces per trap, just based on the data that I have at the moment, that's not a final figure, but just to put an amount up here for the time being, adding that to the amount estimated by a Clean Bay blueprint, we're looking at somewhere around 400 million pieces of polystyrene flowing down the Yarra every year. What do I say about that? You know, it's not surprising to me. It could be higher. I would believe it based on what I've seen. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that figure changes once we get the rest of our data in. But you know, 400 million pieces. Yeah, we'll do something about it. So what's going to be interesting to see, which traps have the highest amounts of EPS? You know, we kind of got an indication of that so far, and it'd be really interesting to look at the locations of those traps and maybe see why have they ended up with as many as they have. Was that an anomaly? Maybe. So that'd be interesting. And the final counts of EPS, well, that was meant to say overall in the Yarra, slight typo there. So that's what I'll be looking to see once the final data comes in, and we'll run some other calculations to get maybe an amount in volume per year, and all of the calculations will be made publicly available for you to scrutinize if you so wish. Yeah, I don't know what you get up to on a Friday night, but maybe that's what you want to do. So moving on from that, one of the things we spoke about was laboratory fingerprinting. You know, can we analyze the polystyrene pieces to trace it back to where it might have come from? And really to do that, you need to have some polystyrene from a source, analyze it, look at the markers on it, the chemical markers, and then match it up with what we're finding in the river. But along with my project partner, Cheyenne from Clean Water Group, who unfortunately moved on from Clean Water Group roughly halfway through the project, we engaged 5 labs to discuss this kind of project, and what we found was it is possible to look at the markers on polystyrene and maybe trace it back to where it's come from. And so we created a project outline for this, and you know, it was outside the funding that we had, but it is probably not as expensive as you might think to run a pilot project. So if not us, it'd be interesting to see someone else do this and see what they find. So we just wanted to know if it was possible first, and then that provides opportunities for actually running the study, which would be great. And lastly, the Yarra Catchment Atlas. So a very powerful tool. If you haven't been on the Yarra Catchment Atlas, it's a mapping tool as well as some other things, which I can show you a quick image of. So it looks something like this, where you can visualize a whole bunch of layers on top of each other, geospatially mapped out. So the Atlas has been a project that's been ongoing, but in terms of polystyrene pollution, it's provided us with a really unique opportunity where we've created a community observation tool. So you can go on, or if you find polystyrene in the street, and I heavily encourage you to do this, if you do find polystyrene in the street, please do take a photo of it. And if you can't record it where you are, because it will ask for your location, if you can't record it where you are, make note of where you are, so that if you want to do it at a later date, you can. But what you can do is submit your observation of polystyrene, give it a hotspot rating for the amount that you've seen, add a description in there, and then upload the photos and submit it. And what will happen is your sighting will come up on this layer, where we can now view all the little bits of polystyrene that we know are in our streets. So it's one thing for us to do a study and to go every month to a site and audit it, but I know specifically that from day to day it's going to change. So if you do see polystyrene in the street, if you do see polystyrene anywhere really, it can be someone's bin and the lid is open and the polystyrene's hanging out, take a photo of it, like show us, let's have a record of it, and we can compare it with other sightings and just have a look around, and we'll build up a layer which is helpful for, as you can see, so many councils. Like the councils might love to know if there's a hotspot going on. You might find a business, you might find a strip of shops, takeaway shops out the back, you might have a look and see polystyrene all over the place. So if you do come across polystyrene, take a photo in the very least, because you can always upload it at a later time if you're not in a position to do so. So recommendations. Many recommendations were made in the previous report and all of them were great. And so I think if I was going to add something to those, and when I write the report, I'll include all the previous ones plus the new ones, but it's so clear polystyrene just can't be left on site anywhere uncovered, not just for construction. If you're going to leave polystyrene outside, it's going to break up and it's going to fly away. The evidence is so clear. I mean, bar having everyone see it happen themselves, there's little to be said. Cutting and handling practices also need attention. So this is for construction, but also could be applied to other industries. But when I say cutting and handling, specifically because these large chunks of polystyrene are being cut up on site. So we really need to pay attention to the cutting and handling. Thank you, Candice, for that time reminder. We've gone a little bit over, or almost gone over, but we're nearing the end now. Retail recommendations, loading docks need serious attention. They were a large source of polystyrene pollution consistently. I mean, it's not really a surprise to those who are working on pollution, but loading docks need serious attention, and that's going to be a big effort. There's no reason that a lot of these big chains can't, one, clean up their loading docks, and two, lead some sort of product stewardship. I was talking with Alistair from the EPA, and it's like, why are these places not drop-off points? We need drop-off points, because just like it's super convenient to have red cycle operating at shopping centers. Yeah, just like we have red cycle operating at shopping centers, it brings people in. Like, people start to recycle things when things are made convenient, and at the moment the drop-off locations for polystyrene are not convenient, and so we need to address that issue. The next steps, I see two pathways for reducing polystyrene pollution. First one is reduce and improve handling. How do you do that? Great question. We could start with engaging industries, talking, presenting our evidence, presenting our data, and just seeing what can we do. And then we also need to educate them for those who aren't aware of what's going on, because there likely is some miscommunication going on. And we need to find pathways for new materials. So alternatives to polystyrene is a big pathway for the future. We've been talking quite a lot with Fungi Solutions, who make mycelium products, mushroom foam products, and I couldn't endorse them enough. I can't wait for them to take over everything, and their products. So mycelium and polystyrene perform similar functions, not entirely the same, but similar enough. That we have alternatives, not just mycelium. Woolcool is an example of a company bringing a more sustainable solution to polystyrene. And I'm sure there's many more that I'm not even aware of yet. And so I think alternatives will really start to take off. We're seeing sustainable packaging coming. It's not some distant future thing, like it's happening now. We just need it to upscale. So those are the two ways I think we will reduce polystyrene pollution. Obviously alternatives are always better to just improving our handling practices, but we have to start with what we can do today as well. So I'd really like to thank DELP for funding this project. Everything that you just saw would not have happened without their support. So we very, very much would like to thank them. I'd also like to thank Clean Water Group for their efforts and support on not just this phase of the project, but also the previous one. They do some great work, so we really love to partner with them. There's a litter infographic that will be launched, is launching. This is something that I designed for City of Melbourne. We worked together to kind of pull as much data together as we could from some of the larger, and look, this doesn't represent all the litter initiatives that are being done. I could make this thing longer than it already is, but just as a baseline, City of Melbourne wanted to kind of pull together a visual representation of what's been done over the last 2-3 years, because they were receiving a lot of complaints about litter in the river. And it's like, well, litter's in the river for a reason. We are doing something, we are trying to understand it and find out where it's coming from, and we have an idea of where it's coming from. So yeah, we've just kind of put together a kind of fun, engaging way to understand some of the initiatives that have been taken on litter in the river. I would love to include many more community organisations. There's so many people doing great stuff, from small 5-person cleanups all the way up to spending millions of dollars on litter initiatives. So yeah, I would just like to say that this isn't everything, and there are so many people on the ground doing such great work that probably doesn't get as much attention as it should. And so we might be able to put together another infographic that highlights that. But yeah, keep your eyes out for this. We'll be kind of sharing it in a downloadable form to have a look at. And lastly, the Aeroplastic Puddle is happening on the 4th of December. It's an initiative that we started. We are making a kayak out of plastic bottles, and one of the riverkeeper, I believe one of the riverkeeper staff members, is going to ride that plastic bottle kayak down the Yarra, and there'll be a whole bunch of cleanups happening along the Yarra. So we encourage you to. We will have coverage of the day, so you should know when we're going past. So if you do have access to the Yarra and are around the Yarra, come down and give us a wave from the banks as we pass, and yeah, clean up some litter in the area. So there's more details online, and I believe Candice might be putting a link into the chat. So yeah, let's end that there, and let's begin questions and discussions. So I'll open up the floor, I guess. If anyone has any questions, can we please use our raised hand? And Candice, maybe you want to kind of, I don't know, pick people as they put their hand up. I'm not sure. I might keep my I might stop sharing for the moment just so I can see, and then I'll bring it back up if it's relevant. So I think we've got Andrew raised his hand first.
Yeah, fantastic talk, Anthony. Thanks so much. Look, I put the question in the chat. I'm not sure if it's if you covered it in the previous talk or anything, but has Parks Victoria or you guys actually modelled the flow of the Yarra and actually worked out what percentage of water actually goes through those Bandalong traps?
Yeah, great question. I have not personally. I believe Parks Vic do have models of the flow of the water, and especially since when the traps were designed and put in place, they were put in place based on water flow to capture the most amount of, let's say, litter as possible. So they are strategically placed. So there must be a model of that. I haven't seen it before. Parks Vic would have an idea. That's a great question. I can note that and maybe look into it a bit more because it just makes sense. Yeah, thank you. Do we have any questions that I've missed from the chat? What would be the volume or the space that much polystyrene takes up? Great question. I will endeavour to work that out and put that in the report, how much the volume of polystyrene is getting caught in those traps. Yeah, keep an eye out for the report. I'm not sure if it's going to release by the end of this year. It might be early next year. I want to take my time and make sure that it, you know, it's easy to read and understand and visualize. So I will put a bit of work into that. So do stay tuned. It will come out eventually. No. Volunteers, did you like seeing? Oh, we've got a hand raised. Jody, yep, go ahead.
Oh yes, great presentation, Anthony. Thank you, and a lot of hard work on that as well. I had well, one question was what species is or what species are groups most concerned about as far as the polystyrene effects are concerned, I guess the flow on effects and consequences of having that much in the river.
Yeah, for sure. Good question. So species by species, I couldn't tell you myself. I have read numerous studies that I do know that there are individual species that have been studied and documented with polystyrene pollution ingested. I believe from what I've read that microinvertebrates, so like really small pieces of plastic are being ingested at a microscopic level, and biomagnification of bioaccumulation of plastic and toxins is an issue. And so if bioaccumulation is an issue, well, that would suggest that ingestion is happening at many levels of the trophic cascade. You would have microinvertebrates being eaten by small fish, being eaten by larger fish, and birds as well have been well documented to eat plastic. So species by species, I couldn't put an exact name to them, but my bets or the research that I've read would suggest that, you know, your wetland birds, aquatic birds, and aquatic species are the most likely to encounter and consume plastic pieces, including polystyrene. If anyone knows any different or knows any better, pop it in the chat. Joe, do you have your hand raised again, or?
Yeah, that's still just my same hand raised. Although, yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. We're just thinking about, we get a lot of polystyrene in the Werribee River through Marsh for the same reasons. Yeah, so we're just trying to work out what the impact on platypus would be. But if it's affecting macroinvertebrates, then it would definitely affect platypus.
Yeah, I think you might find that if the platypus aren't ingesting the pieces directly, they will be receiving some effects from some of the food that they eat.
Yep.
And look, that would need to be, you know, documented and studied, but reasonably guessing based on the studies that have been done on other species, it's likely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, sorry to ask another question, but that was a great question, Jody, and I wanted to follow up on what you mentioned, Anthony, with the bioaccumulation. So you mentioned that toxins that can attach to plastics in general can accumulate in a system. Do you know of any specific reference to polystyrene, and if there's any studies specifically looking at polystyrene, if the actual chemicals in polystyrene themselves are toxic, or if it's just the toxins that are actually present in the river already that attach themselves to polystyrene and then get ingested by animals that's the problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. My understanding from what I've read is that the answer is both. Polystyrene, if you ask the polystyrene industry in Australia, they will probably say that imported polystyrene is the bad polystyrene because there's not as many codes and regulations around what they're allowed to put in it. We know that flame retardants are an issue with polystyrene, especially for some of the applications that it's used for. And there is one other chemical in polystyrene that I cannot remember at the moment. But it is documented, it is being studied, and all plastics or petrochemical fragments in the water apparently, as far as I've read, attract toxins in the form of PCBs, which is a molecule, which is a toxic molecule. The Yarra, unfortunately, has had a lot of toxins dumped into it over its years since colonization. Used to be a lot of industries along the Yarra that would just put chemicals straight into it, and those are still kind of hanging around. Look, I'm not sure whether, you know, the flow rate has an effect if polystyrene's moving quickly through the water. I'm not sure if that'll change anything. I'm not a chemist in that sense that I can answer that, but the documentation suggests that plastics in the water will attract toxins that are in the water to its chemicals, to its surface, sorry. But also they come with their own additives into the plastic that can leach into flesh of aquatic life. So it is a problem. Does it include a litter count? And is this open to or other litter in the river? So you can submit any sightings. The Yarra Atlas, you can submit sightings of birds, flora and fauna. You can submit, you know, a sighting of heavy floods if you wanted to. Any kind of interesting thing happening on the Yarra. It's not limited to polystyrene. You could submit sightings of bottles, cans, whatever it is. So yeah, you just pick the category that most relates to what you want to submit, and then that'll be filtered. In terms of a litter count, that's a great question. I'm not aware of a litter count. It would be really cool if it did. Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. I'm not sure how we would get that, but it is a great idea, and I might look at that at a later date. Yeah. Was there a hand up?
Yes, that was me again. I started typing it in the chat, but I'll ask. The other question, I don't know whether you'll be able to answer it or not, is do you know of whether there's any existing or planned behaviour change type programs or projects around polystyrene? Kind of, it's something that we've been vaguely thinking about here, but targeting specific behaviours that lead to this polystyrene escaping, particularly in the construction industry and those areas.
Yeah, 100%. Well, am I aware of any? No. Does that mean that it's not happening? Also no. As far as I said, as far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of, like, because it also depends on what level. So like wide scale, I'm not aware of. Maybe there's lots of work going on a smaller scale. And in terms of doing that, well, that's what we want to do. That's what we want the next phase to be, is exactly that. You know, getting in contact with maybe the Master Builders Association or like an organization that represents construction and going to them so we can maybe kind of go top down. But there, you know, like there's there you go, litter stopper app. It's one way we could count litter. Okay, thank you. You know, in terms of getting the change to happen, I think that it's going to take a lot of effort from a lot of people to get the message into the right people. That's rather vague, but I think it's open for options. You know, I came across the Premier's, is it Premier's something list? I can't remember what the word was, but you know, we're going to make a submission to the Premier's something list. I can't remember what it is right now, about polystyrene, so that it becomes a priority. And once we can make it a priority with the right people, then, you know, we've got the evidence. The evidence is there. Enough people have done counts and audits and studies and surveys to show that it's a problem. Now, I think it's time that, you know, we bring all that together and go straight to whoever we can, whoever's going to listen. And if they're not going to listen, well, you know, maybe we have to go above them. I'm not sure, but definitely our next phase will be looking at having conversations and generating material and just getting the awareness out there.
Great. Thanks. That's a good response. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you everyone for joining. I know quite a few have already left, and that's fine. But to all the volunteers who I can see are still here, thank you very, very much. I hope that when you see those graphs and those the data, that you think, oh, it was worth it for something, you know, even just the experience as well. So I hope you got something out of that, and thank you for your efforts. To everyone else who joined, yeah, thank you for listening, and hopefully you've learned something and can take that forwards, spread the message, because, you know, plastic bottles get a really bad rap, but polystyrene isn't always in the conversation. So yeah, it's something that we really need to talk about. I'm doing a bit of audit on Tinty Creek. Very good. That's good. I think there's a lot of interest in the Yarra, but, you know, there's so many creeks and rivers around Victoria that, yeah, the more evidence we can gather, the better. That's great. Thank you for doing that. If anyone has any final questions, let me know. Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you for all your efforts sorting samples. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Look out for the report, and yeah, keep an eye on our social medias for any events coming up. Sue and Basil, thank you for your family's efforts on the samples you sorted as well. Matthew, Destiny, everyone who took a sample and sorted it. Eva, thank you all. And yeah, this will be recorded and put up online for viewing later. So if anyone wants to watch it again or share it, you can. But yeah, well, I think we'll end it there.